In a small, peaceful village, surrounded by thick woods and gentle, mist-covered hills, lived a young girl named Mila. She had big brown eyes full of wonder and a heart brimming with curiosity. Mila was the kind of girl who loved to explore, to dream, and to listen to the stories her grandfather told her. Her parents were often busy, and so most of her time was spent with Grandpa Ben. He lived in a tiny cottage on the edge of the village, near the dark, mysterious forest that stretched far beyond what she could see. Mila loved visiting Grandpa Ben. His cottage was filled with old books and trinkets from his past adventures. The walls were covered with faded maps, pictures of strange places, and shelves filled with stories from faraway lands. Grandpa Ben's stories were her favorite. He would sit by the fire, his voice soft but full of excitement, and tell Mila about his adventures. Some of the stories made Mila feel a little uneasy, especially the ones about strange creatures and mysterious people who lived in the woods. One afternoon, as the sun was setting and the sky turned a soft orange, Mila sat with Grandpa Ben by the fireplace. She had just finished reading a book and looked up at him. "Grandpa," she asked, "tell me another one of your stories. The one about the shadow catcher." Grandpa Ben smiled, his wrinkled face softening with warmth. He leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. "You want to hear the story of the shadow catcher again?" he asked, his voice low and a little serious. Mila nodded eagerly. The shadow catcher was one of the most mysterious and exciting stories Grandpa Ben had ever told her. She loved the idea of a man who could control shadows, even though the thought made her feel a little scared. "All right," Grandpa Ben began. "Many, many years ago, there was a man who could control shadows. They weren't like the shadows you see in the daytime. No, these shadows were dark, moving things that could follow you anywhere. The man, known as the shadow catcher, could make them do his bidding." Mila's eyes grew wide. What did he do with them? Grandpa Ben chuckled softly. "Well, that's the mystery. Some say the shadow catcher would take people's shadows and keep them with him, turning them into his loyal servants. Others say he could punish people by trapping their shadows forever, leaving them without their own soul." Mila shivered slightly. "That's a scary thought." Grandpa Ben nodded. "That's why we must be careful of the shadows we can't see. Not every shadow is what it seems." Mila sat quietly, her thoughts spinning. She didn't quite understand everything about the shadow catcher, but the idea of it stuck with her. The next evening, something would happen that would make her question everything she thought she knew. The following day, Mila and her younger cousin Nina were playing outside Grandpa Ben's house. It was a warm afternoon, and the air smelled of pine and fresh earth. Nina was always the more adventurous of the two, often dragging Mila into her games and making up stories of their own. They had just finished climbing an old oak tree when they heard a strange noise from the direction of the forest. "Did you hear that?" Mila asked, her voice nervous. Nina grinned, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "It's probably just an animal. Let's go see." Mila hesitated, but followed anyway. They crept to the edge of the forest and looked out toward the winding dirt road that led to their neighbor's house. That's when they saw him. Mr. Thorne, the old man who lived 2 houses down from Grandpa Ben, was walking past. He had a long black coat that flapped in the wind and a cane that tapped the ground as he walked. His shadow stretched long and dark, covering the entire path behind him. Mila couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. She had heard many stories about Mr. Thorne, though none of them were friendly. People said he was strange, that he kept to himself, and that no one really knew anything about him. Some even whispered that he was a shadow catcher, the very man Grandpa Ben had warned her about. "Do you think he's the shadow catcher?" Mila asked, her voice trembling a little. Nina, ever the brave one, squinted toward Mr. Thorne. "He looks just like the man in your story," she said, grinning. "Maybe he's out looking for more shadows." Mila frowned, unsure whether Nina was joking or serious. The thought of Mr. Thorne being a shadow catcher filled her with dread. She quickly pulled Nina back into the house, hoping Grandpa Ben would have some answer to their fears. That evening, after dinner, Mila sat down with Grandpa Ben again. This time, she didn't ask for a story. Instead, she wanted answers. She had to know if Mr. Thorne really was the shadow catcher. "Grandpa, is Mr. Thorne the shadow catcher from your story?" Mila asked, her voice low. Grandpa Ben looked at her for a moment, then chuckled. "Oh, Mila, I see you've been talking about that old story. No, Mr. Thorne isn't a shadow catcher. He's just an old man who keeps to himself. The shadow catcher is a story, something to make you think about what's real and what's not." Mila felt a little better, but still, something didn't sit right. There was something about Mr. Thorne that felt off. The way his cane clicked on the ground, the long, dark shape of his shadow. It all seemed too real. But she trusted Grandpa Ben, and his words were comforting. She decided to forget about it for now, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't uncovered the whole truth. The next day, as Mila was outside picking flowers near the edge of the garden, she saw Mr. Thorne coming up the path to Grandpa Ben's house. He was moving slowly, leaning on his cane with each step. Mila froze, unsure of what to do. She remembered how scared she had felt the day before watching him walk past with his long, dark shadow. Was he really the shadow catcher? Or was he just a lonely old man like Grandpa Ben had said? To her surprise, Mr. Thorne raised his hand in greeting as he approached. "Good afternoon, Mila," he said, with a voice that sounded rough but not unkind. "Is your grandfather home?" Mila blinked, trying to push past her fear. No. Grandpa Ben isn't here right now," she replied, her voice a little shaky. Mr. Thorne nodded. "I see. Well, I was hoping he might be able to help me with something. There's a tile on my roof that's come loose, and I can't quite reach it anymore. Would you mind helping me find a ladder or a tool to fix it?" Mila hesitated. She didn't know much about tools, and the thought of going into Mr. Thorne's house made her nervous. But she couldn't refuse. Grandpa Ben had always taught her to be kind and helpful, even if someone seemed a little strange. "I'll help you," she said quietly. "I'll find a tool for you." Mr. Thorne gave her a small, crooked smile. "Thank you. I'd appreciate it." He turned to walk toward his house, his cane tapping on the ground with each step. Mila felt uneasy as she followed behind, but she reminded herself that Grandpa Ben had said Mr. Thorne wasn't a shadow catcher. He was just a person, like anyone else. Still, something about the way his shadow stretched long and dark made her skin prickle. They arrived at Mr. Thorne's house, which was smaller and older than Grandpa Ben's cottage. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the roof looked like it could use some work. Mila tried to focus on finding the right tool, but her eyes kept drifting to the windows, where she thought she saw movement. "Here," she said, holding up a rusty wrench she had found in the shed. "This should work for fixing the roof tile." Mr. Thorne nodded, taking the tool from her with a grateful expression. "Thank you, Mila. You've been a big help." As he turned to walk back to the roof, Mila felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had been so scared of Mr. Thorne because of the stories she had heard. But now, seeing him up close, she realized he didn't seem so frightening after all. He was just an old man trying to get by. Perhaps she had been too quick to judge him. Over the next few days, Mr. Thorne continued to visit Grandpa Ben's house. He would often stop by with small gifts, a basket of apples from his garden, a bundle of freshly picked herbs, or a homemade loaf of bread. Mila began to notice that each time he visited, he would smile at her, and his eyes would soften. It was as though he was trying to show her that he wasn't as scary as she had once thought. At first, Mila still felt a little nervous around Mr. Thorne. She couldn't forget the strange feeling she had whenever she saw his shadow stretching out in the distance. But as the days passed, she found herself becoming more comfortable around him. He wasn't the shadow catcher from Grandpa Ben's stories. He was simply a lonely old man who didn't have many friends. One afternoon, Mila was sitting on the porch when she saw Mr. Thorne coming down the path. He was carrying a small wooden box in his hands, and he waved at her as he approached. "Hello, Mila," he said with a smile. "I thought I'd bring you something I made. It's a little birdhouse. I thought you might like it." Mila blinked in surprise. "For me? Oh, thank you." Mr. Thorne handed her the birdhouse, which was beautifully carved with intricate designs of flowers and leaves. It was the kind of thing that someone with a lot of care and patience would make. Mila could hardly believe that this man, who she had once feared, had created something so thoughtful for her. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I'll hang it in the garden so the birds can visit." Mr. Thorne nodded, his face lighting up with pride. "I'm glad you like it. I enjoy making these little things. Keeps me busy." As they stood there, looking at the birdhouse together, Mila felt a warmth she hadn't expected. She realized that Mr. Thorne wasn't the person she had imagined him to be. He wasn't some shadow catcher who controlled dark, creeping shapes. He was just a man who cared for the world in his own quiet way. Now, from this point, the story will be continued in the next part.